Rain lashed against the windshield, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass. The rhythmic pounding was almost hypnotic, but James couldn't afford to be distracted. The storm was relentless, and he had to stay focused. James squinted, barely able to see through the downpour. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water rather than clearing it. He leaned forward, trying to make out the road ahead, but it was a futile effort. His car sputtered, coughed, and finally died. The engine's final gasp was drowned out by the roar of the storm. James slammed his hands on the steering wheel in frustration. He was stranded.
Damn it. He cursed under his breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The map was no help. It was just a crumpled piece of paper now, barely legible in the dim light.
He was miles from anywhere, stuck in the middle of nowhere. The road stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just him and the storm. The storm raged on, lightning illuminating the sky in an eerie, flickering light. Each flash revealed the desolate landscape around him, a stark reminder of his isolation. James grabbed his phone, the battery icon blinking an angry red. No signal. He was cut off from the world with no way to call for help. The sense of isolation deepened. He rummaged in the glove compartment and found an old crumpled map. It was a relic from another time, but it was all he had. He spread it out on the passenger seat, trying to make sense of the faded lines and markings. He saw a motel marked a few miles back. It was a long shot, but it was his only hope. He had to get there somehow.
Hope for the best, he muttered to himself, trying to muster some optimism. It was a thin thread to cling to, but it was better than nothing.
He muttered, grabbing his jacket and stepping out into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, soaking him instantly. He pulled the jacket tighter around himself, bracing against the wind. The wind howled, almost tearing the door from his grasp. He fought to close it, the force of the storm making it a struggle. Finally, he managed to shut it, sealing himself outside in the tempest. He fought his way forward, rain stinging his face. Each step was a battle against the elements. The road was slick and treacherous, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving. Finally, he saw it again, the neon sign of the motel flickering weakly in the storm. It was a beacon in the darkness, a promise of shelter and safety.
Vacancy. The word was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the storm. He quickened his pace, driven by the promise of refuge.
It buzzed, the letters half burnt out. The sign was old and worn, but it was still standing, still offering a place to stay. James felt a surge of relief. He had made it. Now he just had to get inside and out of the storm. The motel was shrouded in an unsettling quiet. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp and something else, something vaguely metallic. Behind the counter sat a man, his face half obscured by shadows. His eyes, though, gleamed unnaturally bright, like a predator's in the dark.
Room?
The man rasped, his voice a dry whisper.
Just for the night,
James said, shivering, unsure if it was from the cold or the atmosphere. The man pushed a registration form and a key across the counter. The key was tarnished, the number 13 barely visible. James hesitated.
Problem?
The man asked, his smile not reaching his eyes.
No problem, just tired.
James shook his head, a feeling of unease crawling up his spine. The corridor was dark, lit by a single flickering bulb. The light struggled to stay alive, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and whisper secrets to anyone who dared to walk through. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the flickering light. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and turning with each flicker. They seemed almost alive, as if they were trying to communicate some ancient, forgotten message. The walls themselves seemed to close in, narrowing the corridor and amplifying the sense of dread that hung in the air. James reached room 13. He paused, the key heavy in his hand. The number 13 glinted ominously in the dim light, a reminder of the superstitions that surrounded it. He could feel the weight of the key, not just in his hand, but in his mind, as if it carried the burden of countless untold stories. A shiver ran down his spine. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The creak of the door echoed in the silent corridor, a sound that seemed to linger far longer than it should have. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the cold air from the room brush against his face, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The room was small and musty, the air thick with the scent of stale cigarettes. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the room itself was trying to keep its secrets hidden. A single lamp cast a dim light, barely illuminating the faded wallpaper and threadbare carpet. The light flickered, much like the bulb in the corridor, adding to the sense of unease. The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, creating an ever-changing landscape of darkness. He tossed his bag on the bed and turned to close the door. But a noise stopped him. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but in the silence of the room, it was deafening. He felt a chill run down his spine, and his hand froze on the doorknob, a soft scratching sound, right outside his door. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was persistent like nails on a chalkboard, and it seemed to be getting closer. He could feel his pulse quicken, each beat echoing in his ears. He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the doorknob. The scratching stopped. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the noise itself. He stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something to happen, but the only sound was the pounding of his own heart. Silence. He waited, holding his breath, but there was nothing but the pounding of his own heart. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in, the shadows growing darker. He felt a sense of dread wash over him, as if he was being watched by unseen eyes. The silence was oppressive, a heavy blanket that smothered any sense of safety or comfort. He knew he had to move, to do something, but his body refused to obey. He was trapped, not just in the room, but in his own fear.
James told himself it was just a stray animal. He tried to ignore the lingering sense of unease, the feeling of being watched. He turned away from the door, forcing himself to relax. But just as he did, a loud knock echoed through the room. He jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He stared at the door, every muscle in his body tense. He took a slow, hesitant step towards the door. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice barely a whisper. Silence. Then, a voice, low and familiar, sent a chill down his spine. "It's me, James."
Terror, cold and sharp, gripped James's chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since the accident that had left him with a permanent scar on his psyche. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing in as if they were alive, breathing and watching his every move. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume him. He slowly raised his hand, his trembling fingers reaching for the peephole. The door seemed to loom larger than life, a barrier between him and the unknown. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What could be on the other side? A stranger, a threat, or something far worse? His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the peephole, sending a shiver down his spine. He braced himself, then peered through the small opening. The world outside the peephole was distorted, a fisheye view that made everything seem surreal and dreamlike, but there was no mistaking the figure standing there. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the face staring back at him. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a man. The shadows played tricks on his eyes, making the figure seem to shift and waver. But as his vision adjusted, the details became clearer. The man was not just any man. He was someone James knew all too well. He looked exactly like James. Every feature, every line, every scar was a perfect match. It was as if he was staring into a mirror, but this was no reflection. This was real, tangible, and standing right in front of him. Same face, same clothes, same look of fear in his eyes. The doppelganger's expression mirrored his own, a mix of confusion, terror, and disbelief. It was as if they were both trapped in the same nightmare, unable to wake up. James stumbled back, his mind reeling. It was impossible. How could this be? He had heard stories of doppelgangers, of people seeing their exact doubles, but he had never believed them. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, he felt his grip on reality slipping. He was looking at himself. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless and disoriented. This was no ordinary encounter. This was something beyond his understanding, something that defied all logic and reason. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a drum of terror in his ears. The sound was deafening, drowning out all other thoughts. He could feel the blood rushing through his veins, the adrenaline coursing through his body, urging him to run to escape.
"How?" James choked out, his voice barely audible. The word hung in the air, a desperate plea for answers. But there were no answers, only more questions. The doppelganger remained silent, his eyes wide with the same terror that gripped James.
The figure outside, his doppelganger, just stared back, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. It was as if they were both caught in a web of fear, unable to break free. The silence between them was heavy, oppressive, filled with unspoken dread. James's mind raced. Was he hallucinating? Was this some cruel trick? He tried to make sense of it all, but the more he thought, the less it made sense. Every possibility seemed more absurd than the last. He felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear. Something was terribly wrong. The world he knew, the reality he trusted, was crumbling around him. And in the midst of it all, he was left with the haunting image of his own face, staring back at him with the same fear and confusion that he felt. James couldn't tear his gaze away from the peephole. His doppelganger remained unmoving, a sinister reflection staring back at him. He watched, mesmerized and horrified as the reflection's lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Then, the figure outside began to fade, slowly dissolving into the shadows of the hallway. James blinked, unsure if he'd imagined the whole thing. But as his doppelganger disappeared, a chilling thought took root in his mind.
He rushed back to the peephole, his blood running cold. The reflection staring back at him was no longer a stranger. It was him. He was trapped, looking out from inside room 13. But if he was trapped inside, then who or what was standing outside his door?
The storm raged on, but inside the motel office it was eerily calm. The man behind the counter, his eyes gleaming in the dim light, heard the familiar screech of tires against wet asphalt. A new arrival, seeking shelter from the storm. He smiled, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He rang the bell on the counter, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence.
"Welcome," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper that held the promise of something sinister. "To room 13.